Good evening and welcome to Scotland at 7 on Friday the 8th of September. My name is Brian Liddy. I've got Ukraine update day 562 for you this evening. President Volodymyr Zelensky has singled out 3 military units for praise for very effective action against Russian troops on the front in eastern and southern Ukraine. President Zelensky provided few details in his nightly address, but said 1 National Guard unit was fighting in the east and 2 in the south, the focal point of Kyiv's 3-month-old counter-offensive. The US Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, praised Ukraine's strength in the face of the Russian invasion during a visit to the Chernihiv region, which was occupied by Moscow at the beginning of the war. Blinken and Romanian Foreign Minister Luminița Odăbescu also held a call to discuss Romania's investigation into drone debris found in Romania close to its border with Ukraine, the US State Department said. Romania's Defence Ministry said on Thursday that the country did not face any direct threat to its territory or territorial waters from Russian strikes on Ukraine on Wednesday night. NATO chief Jens Stoltenberg has said there was no sign Russia had launched a deliberate attack on alliance member Romania after the possible drone debris was found near its border with Ukraine. Some of the victims of a deadly Russian missile attack at a busy market in eastern Ukraine yesterday were buried. At least 17 people were killed and 32 wounded in the attack on Kostianivka in Ukraine's Donetsk region. Russia has maintained its bombing campaign against Ukrainian food exports, with the 4th drone attack in 5 days on grain silos and other infrastructure around the port of Izmail along the river Danube. Ireland said that about 500 Ukrainians were arriving in the country a week, joining tens of thousands of their compatriots who fled to the island over the last 18 months. French President Emmanuel Macron said the Russian flag has no place at next year's Paris Olympics because of the war crimes committed by Vladimir Putin's regime in Ukraine. The head of the US Senate Foreign Relations Committee has demanded that the US's top 3 oilfield services companies cease all investments in Russia's oil fuel infrastructure. British American Tobacco said it would sell its last cigarette in Russia within a month, ending its presence in the world's 4th largest tobacco market a year and a half after it first promised to do so in response to the invasion of Ukraine. For the first time in nearly 4 years, new staff have been allowed at the Russian embassy in the North Korean capital of Pyongyang after anti-pandemic measures blocked most travel and led to many embassies to close. On Thursday, President Zelensky and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu discussed ways in which Israel can support Kyiv in its conflict with Russia. Our next item tonight is no new offshore wind farms will go ahead in the UK after the latest UK government auction, in which critics have called the biggest clean energy policy failure in almost a decade. None of the companies hoping to build big offshore wind farms in UK waters took part in the UK government's annual auction, which awards contracts to generate renewable electricity for 15 years at a set price. The companies had warned ministers repeatedly that the auction price was set too low for offshore wind farms to take part after costs in the sector soared by about 40% because of inflation across their supply chains. The UK government confirmed today that only 3.7 gigawatts of new clean energy projects secured a contract, compared with 11 gigawatts in the previous auction, a significant blow to the UK's clean energy targets. The winning projects include solar farms, onshore wind farms and a record number of tidal power projects. However, the absence of giant new offshore wind farms will make the UK's climate targets far more difficult to achieve. Industry insiders said the 3 biggest offshore wind developers in the UK, SSE, Scottish Power and the Swedish company Vattenfall, were forced to sit out the bidding after UK government ministers refused to heed their warnings. The industry had consistently called for the higher cost of offshore energy to be taken into account by adjusting the auction's maximum price after Vattenfall announced earlier this year that it would cease working on the multi-billion-pound Norfolk Boreas wind farm because rising costs meant it was no longer profitable. Keith Anderson, the chief executive of Scottish Power, said, "This is a multi-billion-pound lost opportunity to deliver low-cost energy for consumers and a wake-up call for government. We all want the same thing, to get more secure, low-cost green offshore wind built in our waters. Scottish Power is in the business of building wind farms, and our track record is second to none in terms of getting projects over the line when others haven't been able to. But the economics simply did not stand up this time around." The UK government has been heavily criticised for its record on green energy policy, which has included blocks on onshore wind, the solar industry and low levels of home insulation. Greenpeace described the outcome of the latest auction as the biggest disaster for clean energy policy in the last 8 years because it risked jeopardising the UK's plan to triple its offshore wind power capacity by 2030 and cast doubt on Britain's climate targets. Renewable energy developers were required to submit sealed bids in the auction in the first half of August, before officials ranked the most competitive proposals over the second half of the month. Only the projects offering the lowest cost to energy bill payers secure contracts. Solar power made up half of the clean energy capacity to win at the auction. Almost 1.5 gigawatts of onshore wind capacity secured a contract in the auction. The tidal power sector secured a record capacity of more than 50 megawatts. There were also 3 winning projects for geothermal power for the first time, totalling 12 megawatts of capacity. The SNP has consistently called for control of energy policy in Scotland to be devolved to the Scottish Parliament. Ahead of a visit to Rutherglen and Hamilton West later today, First Minister Humza Yousaf has said Westminster must give homeowners across Scotland the support they deserve by introducing tax relief on mortgage payments. The SNP leader has thrown his weight behind Katie Loudon's campaign for more financial support for homeowners, after she wrote to Tory Chancellor Jeremy Hunt calling for a mortgage tax relief scheme. Earlier today, the SNP's candidate in the Rutherglen and Hamilton West by-election, Katie Loudon, called on Westminster to reintroduce tax relief on mortgage payments in a bid to support homeowners across Scotland during the cost of living crisis. Ms Loudon has written to the UK Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, demanding more action to support homeowners, pointing out that a tax relief scheme could reduce the burden being felt by working households in Scotland by allowing people to make mortgage repayments from their salary prior to tax and national insurance deductions. The Mirris scheme was previously available in the 1980 and 1990s and gave mortgage holders interest relief at source. This evening, Humza Yousaf is expected to join by-election candidate Katie Loudon on the campaign trail at the Hamilton Gymnastics Club, the biggest gymnastics club in Scotland. Speaking ahead of the visit, Humza Yousaf said, "As a direct result of financial mismanagement at Westminster, homeowners and first-time buyers in Scotland have been left dealing with the excruciating mortgage rates. Westminster isn't doing enough for homeowners who are struggling to cope with the cost of living crisis Westminster created. The UK government must do more for those with mortgages, especially given Westminster has created the cost of living crisis." While Sir Keir Starmer and his Labour Party colleagues continue to make screeching U-turns to try and win Tory votes, the SNP is offering real solutions for people struggling with the cost of living and outlining its positive vision for Scotland. A vote for the SNP's Katie Loudon is a vote for a local MP that understands the real issues facing the people of Rutherglen and Hamilton West and who will secure their voice is heard at Westminster, she said. SNP politicians representing Glasgow have written to the Home Secretary to call on the UK government to urgently fund a pilot-safe consumption facility in Glasgow, following recommendations from a report from Westminster's Home Affairs Committee. The Home Affairs Committee report suggested that hygienic, safe and secure consumption rooms could help to reduce harm and deaths associated with illicit drug use and recommended the scheme be piloted in Glasgow, a step that the SNP has repeatedly called for. The report also called for drugs policy to sit within the Department of Health and Social Care alongside the Home Office, so that targeted public health interventions can be used to reduce patterns of illicit drug use in the long term. Signed by 13 Glasgow SNP politicians, the letter said that tackling problematic drug use required bold and courageous thinking, and argued that if the UK government ignores the report's recommendations and continues to block Scotland's ability to implement life-saving work, the relevant powers be devolved to Holyrood so action can be taken. Commenting, SNP MSP Colcab Stewart said, "Far too many lives in Scotland are still being lost to drug misuse, and we need direct, bold and courageous thinking if we want to turn the tide on these statistics. While the most recent drug death statistics showed a small improvement, much work is still urgently needed." She went on to say, "For years now the SNP has called for the funding of safe consumption facilities so that people who use illicit drugs can do so in a safe and supervised environment, which removes the stigma that so often prevents people from accessing the help they need, and now a Tory-led committee agrees. Westminster needs to take heed of their committee's recommendations and start treating problematic drug use like the public health emergency that it is. If not, they should at least devolve the appropriate powers to Scotland so that we can make our own policy and implement safe consumption facilities so that people involved with illicit drugs are treated with the compassion and respect they deserve." The UK government has said it will not call for the release of a Scot held in an Indian jail for 5 years, claiming that it would not be in his best interests. There have been repeated calls for the UK government to do more to secure the release of Jagtar Singh Johal, who claims to have been tortured and forced to make a confession. He faces terrorism charges, and the first stages of his trial have just started after repeated delays caused by disputes over evidence. This week, more than 70 MPs called on Rishi Sunak to request Johal's release when he travels to Delhi for the G20 Leaders Summit. The refusal to call for his release came in a letter sent to Johal's MP, Martin Docherty-Hughes, dated the 8th of September and signed by the Minister for Asia, Lord Ahmad. Ahmad wrote, "Having carefully considered the potential benefits and risks to Mr. Johal of calling for his release, as well as the likely effectiveness of doing so, we do not believe this course of action would be in his best interests. With Mr. Johal's trial underway, our assessment is that such a call would be considered interference in the Indian judicial process, which could jeopardise our ability to consular assistance." Ahmad added, "We will continue to do what we can to support Mr. Johal and his family, always guided by our assessment of Mr. Johal's best interests." The original letter by Mr. Docherty-Hughes was sent on the 20th of July, but he only received a reply almost 2 months later, the day after a separate letter concerning Johal's fate, signed by more than 75 MPs, was publicised in the media. The UK Foreign Office said its decision to refrain from calling for his release did not represent a weakening of its position. His brother and the campaign group Reprieve rejected that claim as absurd. Martin Docherty-Hughes said, "To lead is to choose, and the Prime Minister has chosen not only to prioritise a desperate bid for a free trade deal with India over the life of a British citizen, he has also chosen to snub a perfectly reasonable request to him made by more than 70 of his fellow MPs across all parties." Dan Dolan, the Advocacy Director of Reprieve, said, "The government insists that its position on Jagtar's case is not weakening, but it's honestly hard to see how it could be any weaker. Johal, 36, from Dumbarton, was a blogger and campaigner for Sikh human rights, which was said to have brought him to the attention of the Indian authorities. He travelled to India in October 2017 to get married." Reprieve says that while he was out shopping with his wife, Johal was hooded, bundled into a car by men in plain clothes, severely tortured and made to sign blank pieces of paper. In May 2022, the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention concluded that he had been arbitrarily detained and that his detention breached international human rights law. There were also suggestions in August 2022 that British security services may have transferred information to Indian authorities that led to Yohal's arrest. A major new report by the UN has found that governments around the world are failing to cut greenhouse gas emissions fast enough to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement and to stave off climate disaster. Meeting the goals will require phasing out all unabated fossil fuels, the report says, in an acknowledgement that some oil-producing countries may find hard to take. The need to phase out fossil fuels has not been explicitly adopted by the UN before, under successive rounds of climate talks, and language over phasing out or phasing down fossil fuels has sparked controversy at the annual UN climate talks. There is a rapidly narrowing window for governments to move faster, according to the report, as global greenhouse gas emissions must peak by 2025 at the latest and be rapidly reduced from there to limit temperature rises to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. Emissions are still rising, however, and there is a gap of 20 to 23 gigatons of CO2 between the cuts needed by 2030 to limit global temperatures to 1.5 degrees Celsius and the world's current emissions trajectory. The report, which was expected next week but was published hurriedly in draft form by the UN today, will form the basis of the first global stocktake under the 2015 Paris Agreement. That process is meant to track countries' efforts to meet the goals of the treaty. However, the 47-page UN report does not set out in detail which countries are falling behind, nor does it contain specific recommendations directed at particular countries or regions. Instead, the global situation is described in broad and general terms, which were largely predictable, as it has been clear for some time that the world is far off track to stay within the tougher Paris goals of limiting temperature rises to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. Ani Dasgupta, the head of the World Resources Institute think tank, noted that the bland tone of the report disguised a catastrophic failure. He said, "The UN's polite prose glosses over what is a truly damning report card for global climate efforts. The global stocktake will form the basis of negotiations at the next UN Climate Summit, COP28, to be held in Dubai in November. The president of COP28, Sultan Al Jaber, has repeatedly called for a course correction. He is also chief of ADNOC, the national oil company of the United Arab Emirates, host of the summit. Today, Synthesis report shows that the prospect of such a correction remains far off. Simon Steele, the UN's top official on climate, said governments had to do much more before COP28. The report found plenty of measures governments could take to reduce emissions that would be low cost and easy to implement, including investments in renewable energy and conserving and regrowing forests. Some developing countries will require financial help to seize these opportunities, however. There are now sufficient cost-effective opportunities to address the 2030 emissions gap, yet significant challenges, including access to and availability of support, remain in harnessing these opportunities at the required pace and scale, the report says. Excuse me. Germany's parliament has approved legislation for the replacement of fossil fuel heating systems, passing a major climate policy plan that prompted lengthy infighting in the government coalition and helped push down its poll ratings. Parliament's lower house voted 399 to 275 for the bill, with 5 abstaining, months after an initial version of it was first approved by Olaf Scholz's cabinet. Arguments over the details in the Chancellor's ideologically diverse three-party coalition had created an impression of disarray in the government. The junior partners in the coalition, led by Scholz's centre-left Social Democratic Party, the environmentalist Greens and the pro-business Free Democrats, argued publicly before sealing a bare-bones compromise in mid-June on the plan to reduce old fossil fuel heating systems with alternatives such as heat pumps. It was firmed up into detailed legislation shortly before a planned parliamentary vote in early July, leaving opposition lawmakers angry with the coalition's haste to get it passed before the summer break. Germany's highest court ruled that the vote must be pushed back. The legislation calls for newly installed heating systems in new housing developments to be at least 65% fuelled by renewable energy, starting in January. It allows for existing heating systems to keep running and be repaired, with several-year transition periods before the new rules apply to older buildings. The plan, softened considerably from the original proposal, provides for government subsidies to help people switch heating systems. By 2045, when Germany aims for net zero emissions of the greenhouse gases, all heating systems must be switched to renewable energy sources. The bill is a huge step for climate protection, Katharina Droog of the Green Party told Parliament. We are approving a concrete timetable for how climate-neutral heating will succeed everywhere in Germany in the future, she said, adding that it offered a way forward that was reliable, predictable and affordable to all. The plan will now go to approval in the Parliament's upper house, which is expected to consider it in late September. Local authorities will be able to charge a minimum of up to 100% on council tax for second homes under legislation aiming to increase the availability of housing. If approved by Parliament, the secondary legislation would bring second homes into line with long-term empty homes, which can already be subject to a 100% premium on the full rate of council tax. Latest figures show that as at September 2022, there were 24,287 second homes in Scotland. Second and long-term empty homes are subject to a default 50% discount on council tax. However, local authorities can council tax charges, and the majority already charge second homeowners the full rate of council tax, the maximum currently permitted. If approved, the new measures are expected to come into force by April 2024. The legislation, which was subject to a public consultation this year, is a programme for Government 2023 commitment. It also delivers on the Scottish Government's Housing to 2040 strategy and Butte House agreement with the Scottish Green Party, which includes commitments to give councils power to make the best use of housing stock in their areas, including second homes. Public Finance Minister Tom Arthur said, "We want everyone in Scotland to have an affordable home that meets their needs. While second homes can bring benefits to local economies, we know they can also affect local housing stock, pushing up prices for those looking to buy or rent. That's why we're bringing in this legislation, encouraging more housing to be used as homes to live in, seeking a fair contribution to local services from everyone." Under the Verity House agreement between the Scottish Government and COSLA, we have committed to give councils greater flexibility to meet local needs. This legislation shows how we are putting this into action, giving councils more powers over how housing is used so they can meet local needs and support thriving communities. COSLA Resources spokesperson, Councillor Katie Hagman, said, "We absolutely welcome the ability for councils to take the decision to increase the premium on second homes up to 100%. This means decisions can be made locally by the elected politicians closest to the people in their communities about what best suits local needs and circumstances." A new national centre. The Scottish Government announces a new national centre for remote and rural health and care. A new national centre will reduce health inequalities and improve the delivery of healthcare services in rural communities. The National Centre for Remote and Rural Health and Care, expected to launch next month, will seek to improve the capability of remote, rural and island primary care and enhance the delivery of community-based services. The centre will work with NHS boards virtually and locally to improve rural workforce and retention and develop new innovative services to deliver better results for patients. It will look at innovative ways to upskill staff to help ensure people receive care as close to home as possible. NHS Education for Scotland will lead the work to establish a centre with an initial focus on the provision of primary care. The centre will be supported by funding of £3 million from 2023 to 2026. Announcing the plans as part of the Scottish Government's Programme for Government, Health Secretary Michael Matheson said, "Rural and island communities have their own unique challenges when it comes to providing high-quality healthcare. It is therefore essential that we do everything we can to make sure that these challenges are properly considered and addressed." Establishing this centre is a significant undertaking and will help us ensure that people living in rural communities can receive the care they need close to home. I expect the centre to start by identifying approaches to improve rural primary care, staff recruitment and develop the skills of remote and rural staff. We hope these measures will increase capacity to deliver care close to home for patients and ensure healthcare inequalities some rural communities currently face are significantly reduced. Scotland's councils will invest £5 million this year to develop nature networks across the country to help tackle the nature and climate crises. The funding from the Scottish Government will allow local authorities to develop new woodlands, hedgerows, wildflower meadows and ponds, as well as restoring and joining together existing natural habitats that are important for wild plants and animals. Nature networks provide the opportunity to create and improve active travel spaces, mitigate against flood risk, and give spaces for people and communities to enjoy the natural environment. The Scottish Government has committed to ensuring every local authority has a thriving nature network. Using practical guidance, local authorities and communities can put in place projects that best meet their priorities for nature and climate change. For 2023-24, local authorities received £10 million this summer from the Nature Restoration Fund, including £5 million for nature networks. Including this funding, local authorities have received £21 million from the Nature Restoration Fund between 2021-22 and 2023-24. Local Government Empowerment and Planning Minister Joe Fitzpatrick said, "We are facing twin climate and nature crises, and we have a responsibility to protect our natural environment for future generations." Local authorities have a key role to play throughout their engagement with communities to identify shared priorities and the projects that will best allow these to be met. The additional £5 million from the Nature Restoration Fund will allow councils to develop nature networks and build on the good work already delivered through support from the fund to support new or to enhancing existing approaches to restoring biodiversity. One of the key drivers of biodiversity loss is changes to how land is used, causing habitats to be lost and or broken up. Remaining habitats are often isolated and less resilient, meaning they struggle to support healthy plant and animal populations in the way they once did. If we are to reverse declines in biodiversity, it is vital to address this by developing robust networks for nature across Scotland. Well, that is it for this evening, but before I go, I just want to remind you that here at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of our supporters. So, to everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, we thank you very much. You do know that our programmes will always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 per month, please do consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. Our need to reach our £30,000 target to pay our bills is still pressing. However, the generosity of our supporters so far has given us a little more time. We have now raised nearly £16,500 and we are able to continue making programmes for the next few weeks. But our need to raise the remaining £13,500 is still really urgent. So good night and thank you for watching.
Hello and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Lewis McGlynn.
Hello and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Saoirse Healy.
Hello and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Donald C. Stewart. Broadcasting Scotland is Scotland's independent broadcaster, providing factual news, reporting on the issues important to the people of Scotland.
We are committed to public service broadcasting, and with your support, we will produce even more programmes.
Provide opportunities for young people interested in media production and broadcasting, and challenge preconceptions of what Scottish media looks like, amplifying Scotland's voice and reflecting its communities.
We can already deliver high-quality live news, and we will create the highest quality programmes for you to enjoy. But we can only do that with your support.
So please subscribe to and share our channel or donate to Broadcasting Scotland via the link in the description. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.